This video is brought to you by Babbel. Learn a new language through real-life conversations. So Cameron, what went through your mind when you saw this painting and thought that this was a good idea, that you needed to have this?
Well, it was creepy.
Indeed.
I kind of do have a macabre sense of style in some cases, and this one just really piqued my interest when I saw it for sale online.
It is macabre, it is interesting, it is neat. Mm-hmm. It's also kind of a train wreck.
That is true.
Like, this is a painting that definitely needs saving.
It definitely does.
So this is a death painting, right?
Yes. Now, actually, when I first saw this online, I thought that this was something that came from what would be called the Viceroyalty of New Spain. I thought that this was a Spanish painting that was painted probably in Mexico. However, when I got to reading what's left of the inscription down here,
right,
it's actually from the city of Bolzano,
okay,
which is in present-day Italy. Now, in the Viceroyalty of New Spain, there was this portrait type that was common amongst the convents. One, when they entered the sisterhood, where they would be shown in these, very much alive, in these portraits where they're decorated in flowers. Sure. They have this crown on top of their head. It's meant to symbolize their marriage with Christ and the virtuous things they're going to go on to do.
When they exit?
And then when they exit at the very end as well. Even though this is clearly not from Spain or New Spain, we know this now. We can assume that it would have functioned in a relatively similar way within the monastery. Right. Because we have the date over here, May 3rd, the year of Christ, 1647. I was able to figure out that's the day the person died.
Right.
When I was doing the research, there were actually a couple monks that died on that specific date, so I had to figure out even more. So I went on to email one of the archives in the city of Bolzano to see who else might have been alive, and they were able to give me the name of someone named Remigius Lancer. And so when I was looking at these flaking pieces of the remainder of the description, you can see there's a slight little letter G right there.
Yeah.
So I'm like, okay. And so you can see in and amongst the black little spots, there's just enough little pieces. There's a piece of the little curve of the R.
Right. All right, Cameron, you've given me an art history lesson on the painting, so now I guess I'm going to give you a conservation lesson on the physical state of the painting, which obviously you are very well aware of the damage. You know all about it. You've had the piece for a long time.
It was damaged in the original photos. I knew it was a damaged painting.
The damage is really impressive, but we're actually really lucky because aside from a couple of instances, the painting looks as if it's been completely unmolested. Nobody's done anything to it, which in conservation is always the thing that makes the projects exponentially more difficult. So this painting, as bad as it is, it's actually pretty good. Now I say that, kind of tongue-in-cheek because it's falling apart. Yeah. I mean, almost everywhere the paint is detaching from the canvas, from the ground. Painting, I guess, was glued down to the stretcher support or strainer support and looks like it was just cut off. Yeah, there's just a clean cut right here and right here. And unfortunately, when it was cut, the canvas was cut too. I think one of the biggest questions is what we're going to do with this inscription, because what would likely have been there. And hopefully once we get it stabilized and clean, we'll be able to pull out some more of these letters, and that will either match or not match with what you have determined.
Been able to figure out most of it. And of course, there are parts of the inscription where, we know what, even these very damaged parts, we know exactly what was there. Right. The problem comes, of course, in this big gap right here and this small gap right here.
Right.
Now, in the first gap on this side, this is where his name would have been, right? Remigius. However, before that, there's a space for a couple of letters. And I'm not exactly sure what those letters would have been. Right. The same thing is kind of happening down here.
Right, there's a big important gap here.
This one little spot, that's where we would have had his exact age at the time of his death. And I haven't found his birthday yet.
With signatures, I won't fill in the signature. But with inscriptions and letters, it's a little different. And I think to the best of our ability to finish the pieces that are missing, like where we know there's an I and we just need to put the bottom part, I think that's completely appropriate. Also, the benefit is that all the materials we use are reversible. So if
this turns out to be the other guy,
right, just bring it back, we can take it off and change it. It's a lot of work, but I'm confident that the painting will respond. And thinking about it, the process of conserving and restoring this painting, it's kind of like bringing death back to life. You know, of all of the things I am, a polyglot is definitely not one of them. I can barely speak English and it's my mother tongue. But over the past couple of months, in anticipation of some travel, I have been brushing up on my rusty French. C'est un peu difficile, mais ça va bien. And I've been falling back in love with the language. And it's also been useful here at work. I'm better able to communicate with clients and do research. And Cameron's painting is a prime example of how multiple languages can benefit me here at work. And with Babbel, learning those languages couldn't be easier. Simply fire up the app on your phone, answer a few questions about where you are on your language learning journey, and Babbel will put together a comprehensive course with all of the lesson plans you need to get you learning that language right away. The first few lessons are really simple and straightforward, nothing terribly challenging, just so that you can get a basic understanding of the language. Babbel doesn't want to overwhelm you all at once. But once you are familiar, you can then start to design your specific learning process. You can designate what you want to use this language for, how proficient you are in this language. You can even designate how long you have to learn this language. And then Babbel will take all of those inputs and re-customize your plan. You can even designate when you want to learn and how much time you want to allocate each day. And again, Babbel will customize your language learning plan so that it fits your needs. But one of the really great things about Babbel is, aside from their lesson plans, they have other ways of learning. There are podcasts and magazines that you can study up on. And of course, there are live lessons with native speakers so that you can get some real-world experience, which of course is the best way to learn languages. You can simply book a class and get going, on the go, whenever it's convenient for you. So when you're ready to prepare for that vacation, connect with loved ones, or just challenge yourself, click the link in the description or scan the QR code to get 60% off your Babbel subscription. The first step in the process of conserving this painting is figuring out how to remove the canvas from the wooden support to which it's adhered. In order to do that, I need to learn a little bit about the adhesive that was used. That will guide how I choose to proceed. If it's a waterborne adhesive or a chemical-borne adhesive, I'll have to take different approaches. But in order to figure that information out, I have to get access to the adhesive. So I've sliced back a little bit of the canvas, and now I'm scraping some of that adhesive off of the wood onto the table. If I can gather enough of that adhesive, I can then collect it from the table in this little pile of adhesive, and then I can start examining it and testing it. Once it's in a little plastic container, I can start exposing it to what I think will solubilize it. And in this case, I have a sneaking suspicion that it's rabbit skin glue. This is not a wild guess. Rabbit skin glue is commonly used in painting conservation and art making, so it's a pretty good basis for starting. As I guessed, it does solubilize, and I confirmed it by not only seeing the little crystals turn soft, but also smelling it. Rabbit skin glue has a distinct characteristic, and when you've been around it enough, you can pinpoint it pretty accurately. Now, before I can start exposing this painting to moisture and softening up this adhesive, I have to stabilize this area of paint, because it is very, very fragile. We saw that this painting came in flat, and the paint is just completely flaking off. So I am facing it. Now, rather than doing a full-scale, wholesale facing of the entire painting, I'm just doing it on the areas where the canvas is bonded to the wood. And the reason that I'm doing it just locally is because much of this painting is raw canvas. And I have real concerns about bonding down this Japanese mulberry paper to the raw canvas with the fish gelatin, because I'm going to be doing several other treatments, and I don't want this paper to become permanently bonded to the raw canvas or to be incredibly difficult to remove, which can happen. That would be a problem, and it would create unnecessary work for me and unnecessary trauma for the painting. So I am just locally stabilizing the areas where I think the paint will need it. Once I've allowed that facing to dry, I can come back to the painting with a warm water, and I can start exposing that adhesive to see if it swells up enough to allow me to peel this canvas back. I'm using a little brush here and just painting in this warm water, and warm water generally tends to soften up rabbit skin glue a little bit faster. I'm painting some on the edge of the wood in hopes that the wood wicks it in and exposes the adhesive to the water and softens it up.
After waiting for a couple of minutes, I start to see if I can pry it up, and while it is coming up a little bit, it's not enough, and I'm not satisfied with the results that I'm getting. I don't want to completely saturate this painting and have the paint flake and the canvas move and end up with a disaster. And so sometimes the first approach, or the one that you think and hope is going to work, won't. So you have to pivot. And luckily, this is not the first time I have had to do this or come across a situation where the first approach wasn't going to work. So I have prepared a second approach. And I'm going to be using a router sled to remove the wood from the canvas. I have built up a platform so that the painting and the wooden supports are higher up and allow me to have complete access with the router. I'm going to secure them down to the board, and then I'm going to remove any nails or screws that I find in the wood so that my router blade doesn't hit them. Something like this would be pretty gnarly and destroy my blade. And then I can start setting up to remove this wood. The router sled is positioned in place, and then I can move the router and lower the blade down just so that there's about a 1/16 of an inch going to be removed on the first pass. Wearing eye protection, hearing protection, and a respirator, I can begin making very thin passes over this wooden support and simply removing it. The blade is very large, it's about a 2-inch wide blade, and with multiple thin passes, it just takes off the wood and turns it into sawdust. And this is not my preferred method for removing a painting from a support, but this is one that, unfortunately, all too often I find I have to use. If I cannot remove the canvas from the wood, I have to remove the wood from the canvas. The key here is making lots of little passes. A 1/16 inch at a time is really all that I want to do. I'm just looking to shave down this wood. Luckily, this is a very sharp, very capable blade and a fine router to do so. We don't need to remove a ton of wood like I have in the past, but getting rid of the stretcher is critically important. So just back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, turning wood into sawdust. And with each pass, I'm checking to make sure that the canvas is stable, that it hasn't moved, that the canvas isn't distorting, that the wood isn't distorting, and just kind of checking everything until I've reached a level where I'm confident that I can stop using the router and stop getting myself covered in sawdust, and I can switch to a different approach, one that is a little bit more precise. The router sled is a great tool for hogging off a lot of wood, but once you get down to about 1 millimeter or 2, you really can't use the router anymore. At least I'm not comfortable using it. It's a very fast spinning blade, very close to a painting, and whatever time is saved by using the router, it's just not worth it. And you can see as I lift the painting up, none of the paint is flaked off. The one nice thing about the router is that it's really not all that traumatic for the painting. It spins so fast and it's such a sharp blade that it removes the wood without twisting or distorting or even really vibrating that canvas. And on a painting where the paint is so flaky, that really matters. You can see I can peel off that thin layer of wood, but again, I have to use water to get that glue softened up. So I'm painting on some water on the wood in hopes that it will wick through the wood and soften up the adhesive from the back. I think this is maybe a little optimistic, and it is. After 20-30 minutes, the top of the wood is wet, but the bottom isn't. This wood has a high sap content, and the water isn't really going to penetrate. So I can turn to a scalpel, and I can just simply start shaving down the wood. Once it gets really, really thin, it kind of breaks loose from its bond and detaches from the canvas, which is fine. That's exactly what I want. It just takes a lot of time. I could use a hand plane or chisels for this, but the wood is so thin and it's such a small area that using a scalpel is totally fine. I have a lot of control with the scalpel. It's a very sharp blade, and I'm really familiar with this tool, so I can feel completely comfortable using it. If I had to remove more wood, maybe I would use a hand plane, but again, a hand plane is a pretty rough tool, particularly if you're trying to get wood off of canvas. Last thing I want is for this canvas to crinkle up or distort or kind of get torn if the blade catches or there's too much tension on the wood when I'm trying to plane it off. It's slow going, but ultimately I am able to remove a lot of this wood. And I have to go through a couple of blades because wood dulls a scalpel blade pretty quickly, but this is just part and parcel of the work. There is no other way of doing it. I saved a ton of time by using the router sled to remove the mass of the wood, but now it just comes down to sweat equity and spending a lot of time peeling back this wood. Now here you can see that the canvas is flexing, but remember, the face has been protected and stabilized with that mulberry paper, so any flexing isn't really that big of a concern. All the paint layers and all the pieces of paint that are flaking are held in place by that paper. I'll work until my hand gets tired, and then I'll take a break and go do something else, and then come back to this, and then finally I can reach the end. And here I am still optimistic that I can use water to assist the removal, but again, it's just not working. You know that definition of insanity where you keep trying the same thing over and over again, hoping for a different result? Well, I kind of felt like that here. No matter what I did, the water wasn't affecting any change, and yet I kept trying it. Ultimately, I was able to get all the wood off and begin scraping off all of that excess glue to reveal the raw canvas. With all of the wood and glue removed, I can turn my attention to the back of the canvas and start cleaning it up in preparation for a few more treatments. I'm using my vacuum to go across the canvas and suck up any dirt or debris or sawdust that was remaining. I don't want any of that contaminating the piece or creating bulges or bumps in this next process. And I'm going to transfer this painting from the front of the studio to the back where I have my hot table, and I'm going to place the painting down on the hot table. And these next few procedures are going to be aimed at stabilizing the paint layer and getting it flat so that we don't have any of it flaking off or really distort it. I'm placing the painting face down on a piece of plastic film, which is resting atop a blotter paper. Then I'm putting a nylon release on the back of the painting. Then another blotter paper. I'm going to wrap the entire thing in some cotton webbing. Then I'm going to put one more layer of plastic film on. I'm going to tape it down to the table, create an airtight envelope. Then I'm going to turn on the vacuum pump and start to draw out that air and create even downward pressure across the entire painting. I'll turn the hot table on, raise it up to temperature, and let the painting rest. Now the reason that I'm doing this face down is because of that seam. If I did it face up, I would effectively be pressing that seam into the paint layer and distorting or cracking it. I'm not terribly concerned about whether or not this seam stays flat or disappears. What I am concerned about is damaging that paint layer, and so doing it face down, I can ensure that the distortion from the seam goes backwards and not to the face of the painting. Once the painting has been allowed to cool after turning off the heat, I can remove it from this envelope, remove the vacuum bag connectors, and then peel back this plastic layer, and then we can take the painting over to the drying tables. This is going to be a passive treatment that takes place over a couple of days, but it's one that's critically necessary because right now the painting is flat, but if I don't press it, it will start to distort because of the heat and the humidity that was trapped in that canvas. So I've brought it over to this table. I'm going to take a peek because I'm kind of curious what it looks like after that treatment, and thus far I'm really actually quite happy. I'm going to lay some felt down on the back to compensate for any bulges or slubs that may be in the canvas. And then I'm going to bring down the 2 layers of drywall, put some cinder blocks on top, and let it be. It's a really low-tech solution, but one that works, and I see no reason to make it more complicated. After a few days under weights, allowing the painting to cool and dry and acclimatize to the studio, I can turn my attention to the structural damage that happened when the painting was shipped. Cameron mentioned that when they shipped it, they cut apart the old support and then rolled the painting up, which was kind of ridiculous, and when they did that, they cut through the canvas in several places, resulting in these losses. So now I have to fix them. I've gone to my stock of old canvas and I've picked out a few that I think are close in weight and weave, and luckily for me, I found one that's almost an exact match. I'll lay that canvas underneath the void and begin tracing this area so that I can create an inlay. And the necessity of an inlay is twofold. One, so that there's no gap, and two, so that there is a texture that matches on the front. If we just use the fill-in medium, A, it's too thick and it would crack over time, and B, getting a texture that matched and having it look seamless just wouldn't be possible. So once I've cut the inlay, I can check to see that it fits, place it in place, and then I can start bonding it down. Now I'm using a little piece of washikozo, that wonderful mulberry paper, and some conservation adhesive. And this is mostly just to hold this in place so that it doesn't slide and get all tangled up when we do the next couple of treatments. But because it is soft and it is 2 pieces, this little bit of washikozo is going to add a little bit of fidelity and make sure that it is rigid and it doesn't flex over time. So I've put some adhesive down, laid down the paper, and then put a little bit more adhesive. Then I'll cover it with a piece of non-stick plastic film, a piece of felt, and then a weight, and let it be. It usually takes a day or two to allow the adhesive to dry, but once it is, I can transfer the painting back to the back of the studio for the next set of procedures. And here I'm going to do a 2-for-1. I'm going to do an adhesive impregnation to bond all of that loose paint back down to the canvas and prepare this canvas for a lining. It's pretty rare that I can get 2 procedures out of 1, but in this case I can, and so I'm going to take advantage of that time savings. The first thing I'm going to do is roll out and trim a piece of flat spun nylon gossamer and adhere it to the canvas. And this is going to compensate for the texture and weight difference of the original canvas to the lining canvas. If they're not perfectly matched, we can get distortions in the two, and so this helps compensate for that. I have heated up some synthetic resin adhesive, and once I have mixed it to a consistency I'm happy with, I will roll it on the back. And this is going to penetrate through the canvas up into all of the nooks and crannies and voids where the paint has been lost. And then when it goes on the hot table, it will effectively glue down all of that flaking paint. In addition, this adhesive is going to be used to bond this painting to the lining. Now this flat spun nylon gossamer, it soaks up some of that adhesive, and so it means I can get a better bond because it will conform to those 2 different textures than if I didn't have it. While the painting is drying, I can start cutting the lining canvas. And just using a piece of chalk here, I will mark out the canvas rough to shape and cut it rough to size. I'm not terribly concerned about precision here because much of this extra canvas will be trimmed off when I do the stretching. I just need to make sure that it's big enough. So once it's cut, I will roll it up, move it out of the way, get rid of the roll of canvas, and start preparing for the next step. Now the lining process requires the adhesive to be placed on the painting and the canvas. So I'm using an adhesive film, which is the same as the adhesive I just rolled on, but just in film form. And it has 2 release layers. One is a paper that I pulled off, and then the other is a clear plastic release. And that's what the iron is rushing against now. I'm going to iron on this film onto the canvas and follow it with a cool, heavy weight to ensure that there is minimal to no distortion. It just helps me keep control over the process and keep the results precise. Once the painting adhesive is dry, I can trim off all of that flat spun nylon gossamer from the edges. There's no reason for it to be there, and I don't like the way it looks when it's bonded to the lining canvas, so I cut it off. Now at this point, I can start orienting the canvas onto its new lining canvas and tacking it in place in the corners just to make sure it doesn't distort or shift or move as I transfer it back to the hot table. Again, I'm going to do this face down because I don't want that seam projecting into the face of the canvas. Now, I've spent a lot of time talking about why I don't want that seam there, and spoiler alert, the seam doesn't disappear. It stays throughout the entire painting, and we will see it after the lining process. But doing this face down, I can ensure that it is less traumatic on that paint layer than if I did it face up. Once I have prepared the envelope and brought the table up to temperature, I can extract the air and create downward pressure. And this is critically important because as the adhesive dries and cools, this downward pressure ensures that the new canvas and the old canvas are bonded together. I'm going to go around the seam to make sure that all of it is bonded down. Just trusting the vacuum table is fine, but I can take a couple of minutes just to make sure it's perfectly flattened. I may even use a little roller or a brayer to go across the back to ensure that we have good even pressure across the entire surface. With the lining process complete, I can start removing that facing paper from the painting. And because the fish gelatin was water-based, a little bit of warm water painted on that paper will soften up the adhesive and allow me to peel it up. And as I do peel it up, take note of how much paint sticks to the paper and comes off the original canvas. None. Yeah, that's right. All of the paint is staying put, precisely where we wanted it. And that's because we did the adhesive impregnation to bond all of that paint back down to the original canvas. Even though the fish gelatin is strong, it is no match for the adhesive impregnation and lining adhesive. So, as I continue to remove this facing and wrap up all of the structural work, I can start thinking about cleaning this painting, filling it in, retouching it and varnishing it, and seeing what it actually looked like. But that all takes place in the next episode. So stay tuned and join me next time to see where we end up.